This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host for this week's episode, Paul Jasley, filling in for Mike Rapin. But I'm not alone, of course. I am joined by two disembodied voices speaking to me through a broken radio, Paloma.
Hello, hello, hello.
And Zach McCrary.
What's happening?
Thanks, guys, for joining me today. This is going to be a very interesting topic. We have a special episode today. This is an episode that was commissioned by one of our longtime listeners and Patreon supporters, Keith. Thank you for selecting us to do this episode for you. If you are curious about curating an episode, you can do that over at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. You donate to the Patreon and you get a choice, an opportunity to pick a topic, pick the commentators you want, and commission an episode. So Keith, thanks for doing that. We have a great topic that you chose for us today, and it is all about the voices we hear in our heads when we read comic books. So specific characters or actors, voice actors that we hear when we're reading characters in comics, or certain accents that we do in our head. It's something that happens when you read comics, but you don't think about it. So it actually took me a while to kind of sit back and think about it and say, like, what am I doing when I'm reading comics? Obviously, you hear a voice, quote unquote. And I put some thought into this, and I think we all did. We have a whole list of characters that we hear in our head when we're reading certain comics. So I think we should get the obvious one out of the way. We'll start, open it up, then we can go around the round table. We'll get the obvious one out of the way. We all read Batman comics, and anyone of our generation, or pretty much any generation now reading Batman comics, it's Kevin Conroy. You hear in your head when you read comics, right?
100%.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's not even a question. There's not even a runner-up.
No. When I was younger, it was funny because I started reading Batman comics when I was, probably 7 or 8 years old. That's 1988, 89. And that was, I heard Michael Keaton in my head, or I just heard Adam West sometimes because I was watching the TV show. But then, once the animated series starts, like, that's what Batman sounds like. And ever since then, it's always been Kevin Conroy. Rest in peace, obviously.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought about it, but I guess maybe Keaton was my voice when I was really little, but I don't remember. Like, as long as I can remember reading comics, it's always been Conroy. But Keaton would make sense for back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's such an iconic voice, and like, it's one where it's able to do both Batman and Bruce Wayne, because that's always a tough one, because in your head, when you're reading comics, like, okay, this is Bruce, this is Batman. So, and again, that's one that just seems natural. It's just one I didn't even think about till I, was reading Batman. It's like, okay, whose voice? Obviously it's Kevin Conroy. So
definitely. And his voice was so slick. Slick for that role too. Like the way he differentiated really stood out, even beyond like the actors who have played Batman in live action, I think. Because like Conroy's, he's able to go with Bruce is just that slick, like real velvety voice that he uses. And then he switches to Batman, it gets real gruff. God, it was so good.
I'm curious, are there any other Batman-related characters that you had on your list of voices that you hear in your head when you're reading a Batman comic? Because you have to jump between different characters, obviously.
Oh, I was trying to think for like Damian Wayne. So when he was first introduced, I thought he was like a snot-nosed punk. So in my head, he has like a posh British accent. I know he's not from there. That's just when I'm reading his like very proper intellectual, this kid shouldn't have this vocab. In my head, I'm like, he's like a British boy. He's like young Daniel Radcliffe accent, but mean. So I think I like changed a little bit. He's not as British now that I'm like, girl, he's not British, but it's still a little bit there. Something about like the snottiness or like the air of a posh British accent is with Damien for me.
That's fantastic. I kind of love that.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's interesting to think about that, because there are so many characters now that we have seen adapted to live action animation. When you're younger, again, we were talking about reading Batman when you were a kid. Before you saw the Tim Burton movie, it's like, it's just an adult voice kind of in your head. Right. And then like now there's characters that we associate. And like Damien's an interesting choice because we haven't seen him adapted to live action. There's been animated films with him, but I haven't seen those. But
it's just a kid,
kind of,
just
like
a kid. Normal.
Yeah. But then you also have, Ra's al Ghul's, obviously, why am I blanking on his name? The actor from Batman Begins.
Liam Neeson.
Liam Neeson.
Yes.
So there is a sort of vague, British thing, which is funny to me because, like, for me, that always goes to Thor. There's not a specific British accent for Thor. It's not Chris Hemsworth for me when I'm reading Thor. It's this sort of like generic, over the top Shakespearean, quote unquote, British accent that Thor has. I don't know why. The character is not British or English, but somehow that just works for the character in my head.
Yeah, Thor always has that. Like a Knights of the Round Table voice to me, which it should be like a Scandinavian accent, but it's
Right.
not. It's like proper British voice, always belting out the lines.
Yeah.
Uh, I had a couple other Batman characters, so of course for me, like Mark Hamill will always be the Joker in my brain too.
Yeah.
I mean, no one since has been able to do a Joker better. I give props to Troy Baker, who's done a couple runs as the Joker. If you don't know him, he voiced Joel in The Last of Us. But he does a pretty good Joker, but you can hear that he is just doing Mark Hamill Joker. So
Okay.
so he does a good Mark Hamill Joker. Michelle Pfeiffer is still my Catwoman. Like that is the voice that I hear for Catwoman. And this is a weird one that I never considered until presented with this. But for some reason, the voice of Freddie Prinze Jr. is my Nightwing. Like Dick Grayson, for some reason, is the voice.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because you have to differentiate those voices. Obviously Batman's going to have the gruffer sort of voice, not the sort of. I was never a fan of the. I'm so bad at remembering people's names apparently on this episode.
Christian Bale.
Christian Bale, Cookie Monster Batman voice. That's a little too much.
Yes.
But it needs to be a little bit gruff. But then obviously Nightwing needs to be very like not gruff, very comforting. So when I'm reading the Morrison Batman run where Dick Grayson takes over as Batman, spoiler alert for a 15-year-old comic, it is that more like calm, sort of like gentle, friendly voice versus the Bruce Wayne sort of Kevin Conroy voice.
Yeah, I mean, then that was the beauty of that relationship between Batman and Robin, is that like dichotomy of those two people in general, like the way that they process their trauma. So of course the voices have to match that as well. Heck yeah.
And for me, I mean, as much as I like the animated series, it's always going to be Michael Gauck from the Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher movies as Alfred to me. Like that voice is so specifically Alfred in my head. So yeah,
love him as Alfred.
So that's the Batman family there with some Thor thrown in. So Paloma, is there any other characters that you kind of like came right to mind of like you have a specific voice for?
I feel like for me, in terms of like iconic roles, I think in my head now, whenever I'm like reading Hellboy stuff, it's gonna be Ron Perlman. I think he captured like the tone so well. That's just gonna stick with me forever for sure.
I'm with you on that. Like Ron Perlman is like, that guy was born to be Hellboy, whether he knew it or not.
That's true. Yeah, he nailed that. And again, I think that's a character that we associate so directly with that actor. You know what I mean? He's only there. I've said this other Hellboy movie, but I don't think anybody else saw that with David Harbour. Yeah, so
I thought it was not good. I watched it. I wanted it to be good, but rough.
Okay, all right. That's the review right there.
There were things about it that I liked. But sorry, that's not the topic. I'm going to stop.
Save it for the movie club. But yeah, I think that's because that actor, again, like Kevin Conroy or like, certain actors, we associate them with that character. It's like, that's so iconic. So even if you don't you kind of like hear it in your head without thinking about it. Is that the case? Or just like, you're not like doing the voice yourself. It's just like, that's what pops into your head.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. What about you, Zach? Is there another character that came to mind when you saw this topic?
Oh man, I've got so many. Like I just went nuts and was thinking about so like as far as voices that I hear that like come from, because like a lot of them come from, like we were saying, the iconic versions of those people. So I still hear Christopher Daniel Barnes as Peter Parker Spider-Man. He was the voice from the animated series from the 90s. I still hear him. Like that is the voice of Peter Parker for me. Willem Dafoe is my Green Goblin. But what the funny thing is, he isn't the voice of Norman Osborn for me. Just the voice of Green Goblin. Like it's almost like a Bryan Cranston-y voice when he's not the Goblin, but it's Willem Dafoe when he's the Goblin. I don't know why that is, but and Kirsten Dunst is my Mary Jane voice.
Yes.
Yeah.
I basically went to a lot of spider characters because I'm a Spider-Man guy, but also my J. Jonah Jameson actually floats between Ed Asner and J.K. Simmons. Because Ed Asner was the cartoon, and of course J.K. Simmons is like the amazing live action version. So like it
That's
kind of
really
floats
funny.
around between them. Yeah, for me.
Yeah. I can hear that. I mean, for Spider-Man specifically, I know there's a lot of Marvel characters that are based in New York, but Spider-Man specifically has a very thick Queens, Brooklyn type of accent. So Ed Asner is a perfect fit for that. As I hear that already when you say that. Yeah. I was thinking about other characters that are near and dear to me that have very distinctive voices. Like Judge Dredd is one. I read a lot of Judge Dredd comics, and I love the Carl Urban version of the character, but it doesn't always click in my head. Sometimes it depends how much the character is saying. I think that maybe that's something we can kind of like talk about as we go through this too. Is like it depends how the dialogue is written. You know what I mean? If like Judge Dredd is like giving sort of a gruff single word command or just saying "I'm the law," sure, it's Carl Urban. But it's like if there's a longer sort of monologue or he's having a conversation with somebody, I kind of hear Keith David, the classic actor Keith David, as a sort of like not always super gruff or aggressive, but just a deep sort of authoritative voice. So that's the Judge Dredd sometimes I hear in my head too.
Not Stallone. I am shocked.
Go figure. Yeah.
I actually had Keith David on my list of voices that often pop into my head. And it's not like for a specific character, but for me, if it's like a smart and or imposing character, oftentimes Keith David's voice is what comes to me. And if anyone doesn't know him by name, he's the voice of Goliath on Gargoyles.
Yes. And of course, featured in John Carpenter's The Thing and They Live.
Oh, I mean, legend. Iconic.
And pretty much any documentary you see about professional wrestling, he's probably narrating it. So Keith David's very
that does happen a lot. Do you want to hear a funny story about Keith David?
Of course.
I'll make it quick. So near where I live, there every year there's this thing called Horror Con, and so he's there like every year, and he's the super nicest guy in the world. And my buddies were there, and he was just like walking around on the floor, just talking to people. But as he's walking, he's just singing to himself. And so they saw him a bunch of times just singing to himself, and they came up with this whole idea of Keith David radio. Like that was their thing, because they would just hear him singing different songs. So they actually went up to him and got an autograph, and they're like, "Would you mind just recording a clip just saying you're listening to Keith David radio?" And he was like, "Sure." And they explained it to him. And so now my buddy's phone, whenever it rings, there's like light jazz going, and then you hear, "You're listening to Keith David radio."
Ooh,
and it's Keith David. It's
amazing.
It's great.
I love that. Incredible. So yeah, I mean, that's an iconic voice. Again, not associated with Dredd directly, but somehow it kind of fits. That fits.
I love
Judge
that
Dredd vibe. Yeah. Another one for me, again, when I first read Doom Patrol like 15 years ago, that's long before the TV show had started, I would just hear the Cliff Steele Robot Man voice as sort of just a generic, sometimes kind of robotic kind of voice. But now having the Doom Patrol TV show, it's Brendan Fraser in my head. Obviously, when I hear that,
absolutely,
that character, it fits so well.
He's so good in that role. Yeah, I love his delivery of it.
And on paper, it didn't make sense to me when they cast him. I was like, well, that's not going to work. That's not what I hear in my head. And that somehow his performance was so good, it became the version of Robot Man, that I hear when I read the comics.
Yeah, it's interesting because I kind of like that they went with almost like there's a person inside there and it's just like this hollow, but instead of doing like that, kind of, because that was what I expected from a Robot Man, which is, I think, is kind of what you're getting at. And but the way that the show decided to do it was very cool.
And it's a character that, needed to emote in a way. So having a robotic voice wouldn't have that same sort of pathos where you,
true.
I mean, if you read Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, which again, check out the Patreon, because Mike and I read all of Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, a special series on there. You can hear us talk all about it. That is a book that you really become emotionally engaged with Robot Man as a character. So you kind of need a voice, that you can relate to. It can't just be a, robotic sort of like flat artificial voice. So yeah, Brendan Fraser is Robot Man for me now and forever.
Nice.
Yeah, Paloma, do you have another one on your list you want to run through?
Yeah, I was trying to really think about, again, like, I'm not even that conscious of like my reading style. So I'm like, who's in my head? I just know that Wolverine's always like growling in my mind. But
yeah,
Wolverine adjacent, I was saying like X-23. I've read a lot of X-23, Laura Kinney stuff. And I'm like, who is she to me? So in my head, I'm like, oh, maybe sometimes she's like Kristen Stewart. They both have a very like lower register in my mind, like controlled, like like unemotive voice, like on the monotone side. But I know that like she can like branch out. I've heard Kristen Stewart yell in action stuff or whatever she gets into. So I'm like, I feel like this is a good fit. They're both emo girlies, and I think they would like do a good job paired together.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of perfect, actually. Yeah, when I saw that in your section of our notes for the show, I was like, "Oh man, like why have I never heard that voice?" That works so well.
Yeah, that really makes sense. You know, Kristen Stewart has that. A lot of her characters are, not super emotive, but there's something under the surface. She kind of has a flat delivery. You know what I mean? Like, I think she's a very good actress or a very good actor. So it's like it totally makes sense. I could hear that. Yeah, very complex voice for that character.
And Kristen Stewart is very good at the I don't know whatever kind of like tone.
Yes.
And I feel like that's a lot of Laura. Like Laura is trying to not care, you know, like but she does, you know, and that's that's perfect. I like speaking of X-Men characters, God, for me it is almost all of the X-Men animated series. Like those characters are still the voices for me. Especially you were saying Wolverine, Cathal J. Dodd, who's like coming back as Wolverine. I'm super excited about that. He's always the voice of Wolverine for me. Weirdly enough, he is also my voice for Lobo and Grifter from the Wildcats.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just a stock voice in my brain. And Lenore Zan as Rogue, like that voice made me fall in love with Rogue as a preteen. You know,
Yes.
like she's just so good. I just love her tone. And Norm Spencer as Cyclops is still my Cyclops. He's like the voice of Boy Scout characters for me, like to the point where like any character that has like the vaguely Boy Scouty thing going on, it's probably that voice of Cyclops from the old animated series. Even to the and I'm clearly not the only one because I remember that Jim Lee Wildcats cartoon that came out was like a blatant knockoff of the X-Men cartoon. They were like ooh, this worked, let's do it. And the guy they got for Spartan totally sounded like he was just ripping off Norm Spencer as Cyclops.
Perfect.
Yeah.
You know, that's funny. You know, I didn't even think about that. There are so many, like, we talk about iconic, like, you know, actors who have taken on these voices in adaptations. Like, I started reading comics when I was very, very young. And my introduction to comics was the Superpowers cartoon, which is like 86,
It's
87.
old school,
Yeah, way back. So a lot of those voices in your head are just sort of like the bland, generic people. But like, I was watching the Superpowers Galactic Guardians cartoon, which was had a lot of the Jack Kirby Fourth World characters in it. So like the version of Darkseid in there is like still what I hear. And I can't, I'm trying to find the actor's name off the top of my head here. It's Frank Welker, who did like a bunch of, you know, classic animation stuff. He was Fred on Scooby-Doo.
Wow.
He did a ton of voices for the Superpowers cartoons and Super Friends. So like Darkseid, his version of Darkseid is still what I hear in my head. And that, I mean, I'm talking that's like when I was 4 or 5 years old. So 30 some years later, 37 years later, it's like, yep, that's still the voice for Darkseid. You know, even though it's like, I don't know the voice, I haven't heard it in 3 decades, it's still there in my back of my head, you know?
Wow. I can't, like, I'm trying to think, because I knew Frank Welker, and like going from Fred to Darkseid is such an interesting, like, I don't think I've ever heard his rendition of Darkseid. I'm gonna have to look it up on YouTube after the show.
And, you know, just glancing Wikipedia here, he also did the voice of Baby Kermit on the Muppet Babies. So talk about cartoons that were like very formative for me as a young child. Yeah.
Huh.
That's your Darkseid, is Baby Kermit.
Darkseid is Baby Kermit. We got an episode title, I think. Darkseid is Baby Kermit. Another one from the X-Men for me is Gambit. Like that will that guy will always. I didn't know there were 2 people that played Gambit on that show, because the second guy does such a good job of covering it. But it was Chris Potter and then Tony Daniels. I think it was that order. I had no idea, because the whoever did it second did such a good job of just keeping that tone. Yeah. Man, that smooth Cajun, that's always going to be Gambit for me.
I do love that, you know, for the cartoon, from what I remember, they really did keep up with the Chris Claremont sort of like exaggerated accents for the characters. Because if you read Chris Claremont's X-Men, it's the most comically, I mean, no pun intended, comically over the top, accents that he's writing out, on the page. So when you're reading it as a kid, you kind of like hear that, then to have it reinforced by the cartoon, it all makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and Claremont loved his like favorite thing to do with okay, this character's from German, so they'll call everyone Fräulein and my Liebchen and that kind of stuff. Like, that's how you'll know they're foreign.
He knew like 2 words in every language. You just throw in every time they spoke.
Colossus says "da" all the time.
All the time. So this is my question to you: who's your Hank McCoy? Who's your beast in your head when you're reading?
Me?
Yeah.
It floats. This is another one that floats for me between George Buza, who was the voice on the cartoon, and Kelsey Grammer. And I find that like when I'm reading Beast, I float between them, and also those voices are used for smart characters in my head a lot as well. Either of them interchangeably.
Sure. Any psychiatrist character, just Frasier, right?
Totally. Exactly.
So I want to kind of pivot away from, known names, unless you have any last ones you want to shout out real quick, specific actors. Because I think it's kind of interesting. Sometimes there's like, again, just like generic voices. I already mentioned my Thor, just kind of generically British. When I read Fantastic Four, Ben Grimm just sounds like Jack Kirby, because I've heard enough interviews with Jack Kirby, and I know that character specifically is sort of, autobiographical for Jack. Like it's that thick, guy from the Lower East Side, of New York, grew up in the 30s. It's just that rough and tumble accent that I hear every time I hear or I'm reading Ben Grimm.
I love that. Jack Kirby's voice. That's nice. The King deserves a lot of credit, man.
Yeah, and again, I think that's something where if I'm reading comics that Kirby wrote, his way of writing dialogue lends itself to his voice in a way. And I think that's maybe something that's maybe a topic for another episode, because I think it's kind of a deeper topic where it's like, it's not just the voice, it's the way the dialogue is written. And sometimes different writers will interpret a character's speech, quote unquote, a different way. And a lot of Kirby's dialogue is, some people love it, like me. Some people can't stand it. It's very over the top, very dramatic. And it's like, I can only hear it in Kirby speak, quote unquote, in his voice sometimes. So
that's interesting. I dig that.
So any other characters that you hear maybe not a specific actor with, or just a generic voice or something like that?
Yeah, I guess everyone that I think is mean is just posh British, but for a long time, Emma Frost had like a British air to her. That might also be like a running joke made at one point in maybe like Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men. But that's like where I first met her, and I'm like, where did this British lady come from? She's so mean with her diamonds, but I feel like she's just a super blonde version of like Posh Spice, Victoria Beckham ?
Yeah.
In her vibe. But yeah, for a long time, like Emma Frost is just throwing around British insults, British tones.
Gotcha.
Victoria Beckham. Yeah, I can totally hear that for an Emma Frost.
Yeah. And it's not a specific like actor or voice specifically, but when I'm reading, so this is another example maybe of dialogue written a specific way that makes you hear it interesting in a certain way. It's like when I read Swamp Thing, specifically the Alan Moore Swamp Thing, because he kind of started this, it's written out with a lot of ellipses. It's very slow. He just kind of sounds like one of the Ents from what is that? Two Towers, The Lord of the Rings. A deep sort of like elemental voice. It's not even has an accent. It's just like coming from the earth, and it's very slow. So I tend to read that dialogue in my head slower. I try to. Sometimes it's hard. But like I try to slow my reading down when I'm reading some classic Swamp Thing stuff.
That's I did the exact same thing. I literally just finished reading the Alan Moore Swamp Thing run for an episode of my show, and the whole time, because of those ellipses, I just heard Treebeard the whole time.
There you go. Yep. And it works. It totally makes sense,
It does. Yeah, it absolutely, it makes sense. Especially in that run where you're getting away from Swamp Thing being a human who got turned into a plant, and now you've learned that he is just a spoiler alert, he's just a plant,
Right. An elemental, please.
An elemental, yes. Don't want to offend the elementals listeners out there.
Exactly. Any other any other choices real quick before we because Keith did have a follow-up question I want to get to before we wrap things up.
One more for me that, again, this is one that I realized while I was putting this together, was that for whatever reason, Christopher Walken has always been the voice of Mr. Sinister to me. And I can't tell you why. I have no idea, but it's always been Walken. And maybe like less funny old Walken and more like Max Schreck in, Batman 89, like very serious, or not. Well, that wasn't Batman 89, Batman Returns. But yeah, the more serious Walken before he got funny and old.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And now I'm going to read that every time I hear that when I read Mr. Sinister, which isn't often, but still, I mean, that does make sense. It's this Mr. Sinister. Again, I know very little about the character, but from the name right away, it feels like a parody of a superhero. So the Christopher Walken delivery fits completely. I love that. So the follow-up question here that Keith gave us is, so these are characters that are established, maybe been adapted into other media, so we have voices to go with them. But do you hear anyone that you'd want to cast in an indie comic adaptation? So maybe a comic that's hasn't been turned into a TV show. So there's characters or voices you hear when you're reading that are just unique to you or just stuck out, either made up or not. So, Paloma, did you have anything that came to mind for that question?
Yeah, I was really trying to think with this one, and I was trying to reconcile like who today maybe could play this character that I've known for a while. So I was like thinking of Saga, like an animated adaptation of Saga. And I feel like it's a little out there, but I think she could rein it in. I think Alana, the main Saga lady, could be voiced by Ayo Edebiri of the Bear fame, winning all the Bear Awards. Because Alana's funny, sarcastic, emotional, caring tone, and I feel like with Ayo's like range, the Bear, it's a comedy, but she's playing a lot of different beats and emotions, and I feel like she could bring something to the character. Not certain
Absolutely.
there yet.
I like that.
I can hear that. Yeah. She's a great actor with a lot of range, from that show alone. So that's basically what I know her from. Like, yeah, I can totally see that. It makes a lot of sense.
Heck yeah. And honestly, I feel like I don't know that I'd ever want to see a live action Saga. If I see it, I want it to be animated.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That's a good voice choice.
That's interesting because I was kind of thinking that myself. Like, what's a comic that I've been reading for so long that I know the characters really well. And for me, it's Love and Rockets, and there are so many characters in that. And that's a comic that I don't think could ever be successfully translated into a different medium. It can only be a comic. There's no way, right? But yeah, I was thinking about the voice that I hear in my head, which is funny. I'm going to take a quick tangent real quick. Have either of you seen the documentary Comic Book Confidential? It came out in the late 80s, early 90s.
I don't think so.
We did an episode about it for the movie club, so you can again find that on Patreon. But it's a documentary that kind of goes to the history of comics. And there's a point in the movie where they have different creators reading a page from the comics that they've written. So you get Frank Miller reading a page from Dark Knight Returns. You get, I think Jack Kirby reads a page from The New Gods or something. And then there's one where Jaime Hernandez reads a page from Love and Rockets. So he's doing the voices. And for me, like his voice is Ray Dominguez, that character. It's like, yes, that is clearly even draws Ray to look like himself. So that just sounds like Jaime, the creator, across the board. So I try to think of other characters from that comic that I think, if it ever did get adapted, maybe here in my head. And like the main character, Maggie Chescareo, America Ferrera from most recently in the Barbie movie. I think she would absolutely kill that character, It's such a great voice. Again, a lot of compassion, a lot of range. Could be angry, could be sympathetic. Anything you need that character to be. And then Diane Guerrero from the Doom Patrol's TV show. She played Crazy Jane. She'd be a great Hopi, again, because you can do a lot of range with that. She can be manic and over the top or restrained. So those are the voices I'm going to hear in my head now when I'm reading Love and Rockets.
I like that. I like both of those.
Absolutely perfect.
There you go.
Did you have any more for Saga? Because I'm curious about those sagas too.
I was trying to think who for Marco, because I'm like, um, Steven Yen can't voice every animated superhero, even though he's really talented in that. So I was trying to think, and I was like, Charles Melton, who I think he was in May Decembers, where his range really came about. Otherwise, he's famously from Riverdale as Reggie. I don't even know
Okay.
what I was like,
Right.
this he's a dude. He probably has range. He just played an emotional role recently. Maybe he's Marco, but I don't know who would have Marco's sweetness. That one's been a hard one for me.
Yeah, that's
Otherwise, it would like
I don't
what
hate that
be?
choice. I mean, that's
Yeah,
that's pretty good. I dig
Yeah.
that. It'd be interesting to watch the back and forth to see the chemistry between them.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's a good point.
Because that would be really important, obviously, with those characters. There's got to be
Yeah.
tons of chemistry.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
cool.
it's a tough one. Huh. I like those. Yeah. What about you, Zach? What are you casting?
I went with my favorite comic of 2023, Do a Power Bomb. Of course, the man DWJ, Daniel Warren Johnson, and I did a casting for 3 of the characters, the ones that were kind of the most important. I did Lona Steelrose, of course, our main hero. I chose Jessica Henwick for her. If you don't know Jessica, she was one of the Sand Snakes on Game of Thrones. She also starred in the movie Love and Monsters in 2020. She was in The Matrix Resurrection. She was like the main female lead who finds Neo to bring him back in, like that kind of thing.
Okay.
What else has she done? She did Glass Onion. She was in Glass Onion recently, but I really like her voice. Oh, she was Colleen Wing on the Daredevil series on Netflix. And I really like her as an actress. She's got crazy good range, and I think she could bring a lot of emotion to, a lot, because there's some emotional beats in that book, and I think she'd be good for that. I made Cobra Sun, of course, the second main character, Patrick Wilson.
Yes.
From so many amazing things. I just love Patrick Wilson, so let his voice be everything. And for Willard Necroton, the of course the necromancer character of the whole thing, because he's the character is like a huge pro wrestling fan, and the whole book is around pro wrestling. I chose WWE superstar L.A. Knight to be that voice, because he's got this deep kind of voice, and it's booming, and I just think that would sound really good for Willard Necroton.
That's a perfect choice. I can already hear it. Yeah. Let me talk to you. Yeah, that's a great choice. Yeah. I mean, again, that's a comic that, I don't think it would translate super well, but like when you're reading it, you kind of have to act it out in your head a little bit. You have to hear a voice, for the emotion. So like, sometimes when you have like a dark character like that, you just, in my head, I just hear like an empty, echoey sort of voice, but like that makes sense. The character is a pro wrestling fan. He's going to emulate, a sort of heel type character or over the top kind of voice. And like LA Knight is perfect for that. That's a great choice.
Yeah, because like that book, it rides the line so well of like treating wrestling as serious, but also playing up like the silliness of some aspects. And and LA Knight's just got such a perfect character voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the old saying where it's like your wrestling character is your personality turned up to 11. So it's like, it's not like he's doing a cartoonish voice, but it's like over the top a little bit. It's like it's juiced a little bit. So yeah,
totally.
These are all great choices. I can't wait to see all of these movies we just cast. So yeah, if you own the rights to any of those comics to film making the movies, give us a call. We'll cast it for you. So
yeah, we just did part of your job for you. You're welcome.
No, this is a really interesting topic. And I think going forward, I'm going to be thinking about that more. Like when you're reading a comic, you don't really think about it. But again, it's like you just kind of hear a voice, and like, a character like Superman, I guess I always hear Christopher Reeve, but it's not always. It's just kind of a authoritative, friendly voice. So I'm gonna have to pay attention. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up episode where like we kind of like revisit it and think about if those voices have changed over time or like they're different now.
Sure. Yeah, because for me, it's Cavill now, but it probably was Christopher Reeves before Cavill. You know what I mean? And I think it's because like our brains, you know, when you dream and you see people in your dreams, and if it's like someone you don't know, it's probably because your brain held on to a face from from an ad or someone you walked past, you know, like, so you have like a stockpile of voices in your brain that you don't realize are there until your brain just needs to use them for something. And so sometimes you're reading and there's just a voice that maybe you heard twice, or an old, like your third grade teacher, and you don't realize it's her anymore, but it was, you know, it's the human brain is fascinating.
Fascinating, yes. So any other thoughts here before we wrap it up?
I didn't notice for myself when I was like trying to think and be like, who am I hearing? And like, I watch like a fair amount of anime. There's like anime voice actors that I like, but I could not take, you know, like the anime performance and put it into my Western comic book reading. So I was like, no, people don't express themselves like that. They don't, no one's like, but like comics are also exaggerated, like Western comics. And I was like, no, I'm not going to have Sasuke's voice as this character. It's not the same delivery at all.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Delivery between, I don't know that I could pick. If I picked like an anime character or a manga character, it'd be a little bit harder for me, I think, to choose voices of like Idris Elba or something like that, because I can't imagine Idris Elba doing an anime delivery of a character.
Yeah. Huh.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I guess like in your head, you are kind of casting the right voice, whether it fits or not, like the right actor based on what you've seen them in. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, well, here we go. This is a fascinating topic. Again, I think we could revisit it down the road. So
definitely.
Thank you, Keith, for a great topic. And again, if you want to commission an episode, pick a topic, pick who talks about it. You can do that on our Patreon, patreon.com/IRCB podcast. Thank you everyone over there who supports the show. We really, truly appreciate it. I do want to thank Paloma and Zach for joining me today. Well, thank Keith for choosing you to be on this episode, obviously.
Yeah, thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
I feel loved.
So yeah, you can find out more about the show again at patreon.com/RCB podcast. Thank you to Zander for editing it. And yeah, until next time, comics are good, and so are you.